Jeffrey Macris, permanent military professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. What does that title mean?
Well, we represent the permanent military professor as a hybrid, a joining of the professional officer corps and the professor and the professional educators here at the Naval Academy. I spent the first half of a naval career flying aircraft for the U.S. Navy, and about 10 years ago made the transition over to academia, where the Navy provided an outstanding opportunity to go back to graduate school and get a specialty in a geographic part of the world, where I specialize in Middle Eastern history.
And not only an academic, but now an author. The Politics and Security of the Gulf is the name of your book. That's kind of a big topic, isn't it?
Well, it is a big topic. It's a part of the world where the United States has been involved in 3 hot wars in the past generation: the Iran-Iraq War, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and Operation Iraqi Freedom. It's a big topic, and it needs to be discussed and investigated, which is part of the reason why we took on this topic.
And in your book, where do you begin talking about U.S. involvement in the Middle East?
Well, the U.S. involvement in the Middle East goes much further back. We're specifically looking at the Persian Gulf, and although U.S. Navy frigates and some ships had paid some port calls in previous centuries, it really is World War II that the United States and its military gets involved in the Gulf in a big way.
Why?
Well, surprisingly, it doesn't have to do directly with oil. World War II marked the entry of the United States and its military for 2 reasons. One is to provide a secure pathway for supplies to our beleaguered Soviet-Russian allies in their quest to defeat the Germans. So the Persian Gulf route represented one pathway that the United States sent Lend-Lease equipment through a back channel up through Persia and Iraq or Iran, through the mountains, and were picked up by the Russians up north of Tehran. And for a second reason, a much smaller percentage of personnel were involved in training missions in both Iran and Saudi Arabia. But whereas after the end of World War II, our 60,000 uniformed and civilian troops left the supply delivery business to Russia, they left the Gulf, those small number of advisors in Saudi Arabia and in Iran stuck around for decades. And it's that role that really represented America's influence that stemmed from World War II, the prolonged role in the Gulf.
Professor Macris, I always think of the British when I think of involvement in the Middle East. When and how did they step back their involvement?
Well, with regard to the Gulf, the Brits arrived in the 1800s, and it represented their quest to provide order to a part of, on the flanks to their imperial interests in India. The southern coast of the Gulf had been called in the 1800s the Pirate Coast, and the constantly feuding tribes feuds with one another would spill out into the seaborne approaches to India and result in attacks on India and possibly result in weakness that might bring in other great powers. So the British found themselves pulled into the Gulf in the 1800s, not to colonize as they did further to the east in India, but rather to maintain order there. And they did with a relatively small amount of military force. But you're right, the story in the 1800s and the 1900s up until the early 1970s was one of British hegemonic control over the Persian Gulf. And it was in the aftermath of World War II, with the independence of India, that the British began their slow, prolonged retrenchment from the Persian Gulf. With the independence of India in the late 1940s, the British lost the rationale for the military presence in the Gulf, and they lost, to a degree, the money to pay for their military presence there that maintained order for so long.
Did the Americans step in because there was a vacuum? Did the Americans step in because they were asked to?
Well, the story of that handover from British control or shepherding over the Gulf to that of the Americans is one that plays itself out over about 20 years. In 1968, when the British announced their impending withdrawal within 3 years from the Gulf, the Americans initially said in very, very explicit terms, we will not replace the British here. That January 1968 announcement of Britain's impending departure came during the very same month as the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. And there was no interest anywhere in Washington on Capitol Hill at all for any additional commitments, military commitments in Asia. So the British began 3 years of turnover and set many of the small emirates along the southern side of the Persian Gulf, set them off on a path to independence. So in 1971, late 1971, when the British withdrew, a series of newly independent states emerged, but the United States nor Britain was there to help quell some of the interstate pressures that had brought the Brits there during the previous century. So in the absence of American power, Washington had to rely on two surrogates, the Saudis and the Iranians, those same two countries after World War II, of which the United States military stuck around to help train.
Well, first off, Professor Macris, was there any resentment on the part of some of the countries in the Middle East where we talk about taking over for the English to manage their affairs or to monitor our affairs in the Middle East? Was there resentment in the Persian Gulf area about that attitude?
That's a complicated question. I would think for public consumption in the period 1968 to 1971, when the British were managing their withdrawal, many of the Arab Emirates publicly pronounced that they were happy to see the British leave. And under the guise of the Persian Gulf for the local powers, they publicly professed that they didn't want the United States to replace them. In private, on the other hand, the Arab small emirates along the southern coast of the Gulf were petrified. For 150 years, they had enjoyed a certain degree of British protection. And the small emirates and their leaders in diplomatic gatherings, small intimate diplomatic gatherings during those 3 years, made offers to both London and to Washington to offer financial incentives for the British or the Americans to stay. What were they afraid of? Well, they were afraid of their giant neighbor to the north, Iran, that since World War II had really, since most of the 20th century, had been attempting to re-exert the influence in the region that they had enjoyed in previous centuries. And they were also fearful, the Arabs were, of some of their own neighbors. Many of the Arab states harbored border disputes with their neighbors. Some claiming the territory of the others, some claiming the islands in between the different countries. So there was fear of what was to come in the absence of the hegemonic British presence, although those concerns were most often aired in private and not in public.
So when the U.S. stepped up its involvement in the Middle East, what were, in your view, our successes? What were our failures?
Well, again, with regard to the Gulf, in 1971, when Britain sailed away for the last time and set these countries free, there was, for the first time in 150 years, there was no major Western superpower to help quell the disorder in between the feuding parties that had originally brought the British to the region. America, as we previously said, was not interested in stepping in to assume any of those same security commitments that the British did. And the Americans were happy to allow the Iranians and the Saudis to maintain some semblance of order there, even if it meant that they weren't the exact interests of the United States. However, over